Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the HKU Faculty of Law. Visit us at our website, www.hkufintech.com. I'm your host, Ajay Shandasani. In today's initial spotlight section, we'll be speaking with a returning guest and a longtime friend and well-wisher of the podcast, compliance maven Oonagh Berg of the firm Raw Compliance, on an article she recently penned on LinkedIn entitled, How Present Approaches to AI Aren't Working. Following that, we'll be speaking with Italy-based Dr. Mirko Nazzari and Professor Peter Reuter of the University of Maryland in the U.S. on a scholarly article they authored earlier this summer on how well the existing global money laundering control system works. But first, Oonagh is the founder of the compliance consultancy and training firm Raw Compliance. Having grown up in Northern Ireland during the tumultuous 1980s, she is a compliance industry veteran. A lawyer by training and an entrepreneur by vocation, she grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and went on to become a lawyer, compliance officer, and a recruiter, and later a consultant and educator. Having previously taken up roles in Asian financial hubs such as Singapore and Hong Kong, she's currently based in Portugal. Her recent article on LinkedIn entitled Rethinking AI Regulation, Why Current Approaches Are Falling Short, got people talking. Her takeaway is, quote, AI isn't just a technology, it's an ecosystem. Regulating it requires cooperation, adaptability, and vision. Anything less will fail. She goes on to say that artificial intelligence is evolving much quicker than regulators can keep up. Quote, around the world, governments are racing to design frameworks to govern AI use, but the struggle is evident. How do you regulate something so pervasive, adaptive, and borderless without stifling innovation or missing critical risks? End quote. She points out that Hong Kong's current dilemma, as noted by the South China Morning Post recently, is that the city faces hurdles in enforcing rules that would require AI-generated content to be labeled. Quote, experts warn that the market is too small to support bespoke legislation, and without robust enforcement mechanisms, rules around watermarking and labeling may simply be ignored. This isn't just a Hong Kong problem, it's a global one, and it's a sign that we need to rethink how AI regulation is designed and enforced, end quote. And with that, Oonagh, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, AJ. Every time I speak with you, I feel like I'm talking with, the midnight caller. You have a
Gary
voice.
Cole, that show from the 80s.
Yes, Jack Nighthawk Killian. It sounds like I'm talking with. I'm like, hello, we're going to go out and solve some crimes.
Good night, America, wherever you are. Yeah, I remember that was one of my favorites.
Mine too. I loved it. And even though I was quite younger, I really enjoyed it. I think my parents watched it, so I was forced to watch it. The days when we only had one TV in the house. But to kind of onto your point about the article in the South China Morning Post there last week, it really, really touched on an incredibly important point in AI regulation. AI isn't just technology, it's an ecosystem. And this is what I speak to in the article, and which I thought was really important. Regulating AI requires cooperation, adaptability, and vision. Anything else will fail. And the dilemma that Hong Kong is facing in terms of enforcing the rules, and with experts saying that the market is too small to support bespoke legislation, the truth is, fragmented AI in-country regulation is actually not going to work at all. And this is where we need to think bigger picture. And I don't want to kind of be too kind of futuristic, Star Trek-y about this, but we are entering a new phase, a new era of regulation and oversight. And if we look to the likes of FATF and the success story that has created in harmonization of financial crime legislation. We need the same with AI. We need a global body that will pick up the gauntlet and will create standardized, harmonized, should I say, minimum harmonization levels for AI regulatory regulation around the world. Without that, the fragmented approach of in-country AI regulatory adoption isn't just going to be impractical in respect of enforcement, but it also is going to hinder the rollout of AI functionalities within organizations. And why? Because if you're a global organization and you're operating across multiple countries and jurisdictions, due to the fragmentation of regulation, what works in one country may be inoperable in another. So that is it. This is not a Hong Kong problem. This is a global problem, and really is a sign, as I mentioned in the article, that we need to rethink how AI regulation is not just designed and enforced, but also, overseen and governed.
Okay, I agree with you. It's not a Hong Kong problem, but the fact that there is fragmentation to me suggest. I mean, a corollary to that is there are regulatory turf wars, and then look, we're against. This is going on against the backdrop of who's going to surge ahead, China or the US. There is an emerging Cold War. It's been going on really since President Xi took office, and AI is an important field because it has national security implications. And so then against that backdrop, the question becomes who's going to set the rules of the road? Who's going to set the rules of the game? Because neither China or the US are willing to yield to the other. Maybe you can get smaller countries to sign up and pressure them, but that won't work with China. So, and China's position is AI must, as with India, AI must not be allowed to take on a life of its own in our jurisdictions. The US's approach is they want to maintain dominance, but we don't know what more. I mean, beyond that, that they're willing to cede a lot of the ground in the private sector to do what they want to do without any rules, which sounds dangerous, but that's the administration we have giving the tech bros, the administration in Washington giving the tech bros what they want in crypto and in AI.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that is the concern. It doesn't seem like the type of harmonization you see in other areas of law, like with securities, like with swaps, like it seems extremely elusive, Una.
Yeah, I can't solve geopolitical challenges for one. That's an unsolvable challenge. It's a known known, and it's not something that's ever going to be resolvable. What I can, however, do is look at this as from a practical perspective. We have existing platforms, and if I know that the focus here for the AI regulation enforcement has been largely around social media. But a large focus of my work is in respect of financial institutions. And we have seen the success story of FATF in supporting, to an extent, harmonization of financial crime rules around the globe, in particular in respect of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. So what I would do in the AI space is I would be looking to the likes of FATF to set that minimum level of guidance. That, however, correctly to your point, is going to potentially go up against in country regulation where protectionism mechanisms have been employed by the regulators, by the government, because as you rightly said, AI should not be, well, within our lifetime allowed to take on board a life of its own. The unfortunate truth of it is that's exactly what AI is designed to do. It's designed to think. And at this initial stage of deployment, that thinking element is overseen by the ingestion of basically human perspectives. We're teaching currently the systems, and also as a result of that, having to fine tune them by removing bias. But there will become a point where the systems themselves can begin to then think independently for themselves, which we've already seen is beginning to happen in some stages. Last week, there was a really fabulous University of Amsterdam research paper that was published where they actually had set up 500 chatbots. And these bots were all operating independently, and each of them was given its own distinctive characteristics. What eventually happened was that the AI bots began to form clusters, and within those clusters, one bot became dominant, became the influencer of that cluster. And it was such, and no matter what they did within the system to change different settings, etc., the truth of the matter is we live in a hierarchical society. And when we're teaching these systems, that naturally transcends into the system learning. So when the system then began to act independently, they began to take on board the same formation that we actually expect within our cultures and our societies of hierarchy. So that's just a very, very small example of where the systems can and will begin to think for themselves. Regulation is not going to stop that. And we'd be foolish for thinking that it would. Rather, what we need to do is more mindfully ensure that the bias is being removed from systems before the systems start thinking for themselves. I don't know if I'm making much sense here. That's my concern. And the AI will operate irrespective of regulation. You know, it's not bound by regulation. And also the challenge we have as well is illicit actors are not bound by regulation either. So the big
That
threats that
is
we
that is
face,
that is the concern, is it not? That there are those that think there are no limits to
yeah,
exploration of this technology. No, you're making complete sense. Just as it said, as we study when we can study comparative law, your legal system is a reflection of your culture, the way it operates. The same, it would seem, goes for technological development. That's
exactly.
a function of how how many impediments there are, what types of impediments, what types of support structures there are in your society for innovation, and that ultimately all goes in the crucible, and then you see what you get. And so yeah, some people are afraid to see what they'll get. I mean, in your piece, I like the fact that you have this graphic, and we'll be sure to include a link to this on our webpage where you say that again, the recurring theme, AI is outpacing regulation, and that what we can learn from Hong Kong, the EU, and Singapore, and as you nicely succinctly point out, the challenges: fragmented laws, weak enforcement, small market limitations, ethical blind spots like deep deep takes and bias and privacy. And then you look at the EU AI Act, which is many countries around the world are basing theirs on the EU Act, and it's risk-based, principle-driven, but heavy compliance. And the Singapore model: agile, collaborative, innovative, friendly, but voluntary. And then, as you point out, the way forward is unified AI regulation, risk-based oversight, a central oversight body, and global harmonization, public trust. The third point, central oversight body. Again, where will such a body be based? Who sets the rules? Again, nation states are touchy about this because again, AI has national security uh, implications. And as far as Hong Kong, my concern is they're leaving it too much to the private sector, and if you do that, that's a recipe for disaster because again, the stakes are too high with AI.
Yeah, they are. They are. And again, I unfortunately I don't think it's a problem which I'm going to be able to give you a solution to, other than from what I've already said. We need global harmonization and public trust. We need a central oversight body. We need unified, harmonized AI regulation with risk-based oversight. And that is the challenge that we're currently facing. And when you compare the European AI Act with Singapore's model, with Hong Kong's model, with China's model in the US, you can see you can see benefits and you can also see challenges. I'm a big I'm quite adverse to what has happened in the EU with AI Act development at the moment, if I'm perfectly honest. Why? Because it's incredibly risk based in that it's principle driven, but it's compliance heavy, which I've mentioned in my article. I fear that from a putting aside the illicit actors who aren't bound by any of this regulation, who are just going ahead and developing AI technology in every respective area they can, including deep fakes, etc. The EU Act is going to push offshore AI development within Europe. And as a result of that, we're going to be behind in the game. We're going to lose our engineers to overseas developers. Look at the recent hires by the likes of Facebook. These AI engineers, we're talking millions in terms of salaries and compensation models because they understand the value of being a leader in the AI space. So I believe that the EU AI Act is actually going to be detrimental to future proofing and protecting the European Union in respect of artificial intelligence development. And I believe that whilst it's been done with the best intentions, what we've ended up with is an unworkable and dangerous regulatory framework that as I've mentioned, is going to have detrimental consequences. But going back to what I said there, the intentions are correct, but it's just not practical. But then you look at Singapore's model, the agility of the model, the collaborative, the innovative nature of the model, which is everything I've come to know and love about Singapore, having lived there for 6 years, been a PR in Singapore. That
That
is,
is state driven as it is.
but it's yeah.
They're able to create innovation as state driven as it is. Unlike the Soviet Union, which couldn't. As state driven as Singapore is, they managed to create innovations, and
But they
that's
always do. They always do. They are a leader in so many, especially if we talk about financial
they've had their.
crime.
To be fair, they've had their failures too. Same with the Japanese. Not everything they pursued has been a winner, but
I know.
it's amazing that symbiosis between state and the state and the private sector sadly doesn't exist in Hong Kong. You know,
It's true, and that was the big thing that I saw when I moved from Singapore to Hong Kong. In Singapore, it's incredibly collaborative, and nobody is scared of innovation, but it is done in the right way. It's done in sandboxes. One of the great ideas, I know this is maybe outside of, well, actually not so much outside of AI, but it's with technology, was the use case of blockchain functionality in trade finance. Currently, trade finance is largely paper-based with letters of credit, etc. And for compliance risk purposes, it is a massive headache. COVID was a massive eye opener for us because we couldn't even receive some of the documentation that we needed in order to facilitate the screening because there was nobody available to scan it or to send it to us by pigeon mail or however it was still coming. And so we attempted in Singapore a blockchain use case for trade finance, which onshore worked perfectly. But once we moved it offshore, it wouldn't work. And one of the biggest reasons why it wouldn't work was twofold. One, you would need an international body to oversee the blockchain use case within trade finance. And secondly, and most importantly, which is going to be the same problem in the AI regime, is I'd say approximately 92% of trade financing, financing, sorry to kind of double whammy that, is done through open source. What does that mean? That 92% of funding is through unregulated entities, which means only 8% of trade finance actors actually fall within a regulated environment. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to enforce a regulatory model upon 8% of users, of actors, and the other 92%, this isn't applicable to them because they're not in regulated financial institutions. The same goes for AI. the threats that we're facing aren't with the people that are trying to do it the right way, who are then going to be constrained by the developing regulation, but rather it's the illicit actors, the bad actors, who are just like, this isn't applicable to me, and they're just running with it. So this is where we're seeing a really, really big challenge. We need, what can Hong Kong learn from the experiences of recent AI innovation and regulation? As I've said, we need a unified AI regulation that goes beyond fragmented laws. We need a dedicated underlying AI framework founded in core principles with accountability, transparency, and being privacy safe. Like, privacy is actually a really good example here. We look at GDPR and we look at data
And
protection.
The Europeans take their privacy seriously.
We
To
do.
be
And
fair.
to the extent that we shot ourselves in the foot with with GDPR. Why? Well, when it was rolled out, because of the restrictions in data sharing, the result, let me take one step back. If you look at Switzerland, everybody always thinks, historically Switzerland is a very private, safe place for private banking. Yeah, every movie you see, you have a Swiss
until
bank there.
until until UBS and people said, look, bank secrecy died the minute information was digitized. When it was
Per
you with your
per
record
Ralph Hammers.
and your banker had his ledger record, bank secrecy existed in that world. But the minute information was digitized, I mean,
I have to
it was
say,
really
I think that Ralph Hammers did an incredible job going over to UBS and rolling out a lot of the technology. But no, I hear your point. The digitalization, um, when done right, GDPR, data protection rules aren't about sharing data and restrictions in data. It's just about how we share it in the right ways. But what GDPR did was created constraints on how we internally share data for investigation purposes cross-border, which made it virtually impossible at times for us to actually investigate in-house financial crime escalated potential issues without getting approvals at a regulatory or government level. And I actually raised this to the head of the European Commission AML policy team a couple of years ago in Dublin at a conference. Well, it was actually a closed door kind of Chatham House rules session, and not to kind of go beyond, Chatham House rule, it's singular, not plural. I understand that. Um, the
that's right.
response was
It's just one rule, and
it
it's
is. It's
if you
just one
quote
rule. It's
if you
just
quote
Chatham
someone
House rule.
yeah, if you quote someone, ask for their permission. But realistically, even at the famed Chatham House, the London Institute of International Affairs, my understanding is they've come to the realization that in this day and age, with recording technology being what it is, gatherings of 50 or even certainly 100, it's a given that information is going to make it.
Yeah. Well, this is not like a kind of a state secret, but I raised the question about what was being done to help financial institutions in terms of data sharing, where GDPR, the data protection rules had actually impeded investigations. And the policy team at the commission actually wasn't aware about this. And since that, we've also obviously had Article 75 introduced, which then allowed us to circumvent those restrictions that had shot ourselves in the foot. I'd like to think that that was because of me. I'm going to own it no matter what, but the long story short here was, in the Swiss laws, you always had that carve out that data could be shared for risk management purposes, but GDPR didn't have that carve out previously until Article 75 was introduced. So this is why, with the best intentions, we're creating laws to protect the consumer, protect the individual, protect the public at large. But by doing so, we actually could be having kind of call it, yeah, a domino effect. And actually, I always say that risk management is like a game of chess. You always have to think two steps ahead. If you change one control, you have to think of the knock-on effect. And this is very, very true in terms of regulation. We need the right people at the table having the right discussion. And there was a really interesting quote, and apologies, I don't remember the Lord in particular's name, but there is a British lord, ex-Paralympian, um, who was quoted as saying, if you don't like regulation, then you should have been at the consultation. No, 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 no. The right people should be at the table drafting the legislation before it gets to consultation. Because if it gets to consultation stage and you've had the wrong people at the table, irrespective of the feedback, you're asking the wrong people with the wrong skill sets to interpret this feedback and apply that to the actual regulation. So, in my opinion, this all starts much earlier. Do we have the right blend of people sitting around the table in Brussels or wherever in the world that we're sitting and drafting AI regulation? In my view, and knowing Singapore as well as I do, I can 100% say that that would be the case because of how consultative and they are always looking to bring the experts to the table to diversify mindsets, but also to have healthy challenge within a psychologically safe environment, which I believe Singapore has created incredibly well within their regulated environment. But
Uh,
are we seeing that in other jurisdictions? I don't think so.
Look, I agree that the Europeans have gone they've been too harsh in their AI regulation, such that it's you I think as you allude to, it's inevitably going to kill innovation. And once these things go offshore, it's hard to keep tabs on them. It's harder to monitor them. And that doesn't mean that the spillover effects will not be felt in your jurisdiction. But if they were based in firmly in your purview, in your remit, you could keep, you could monitor them, and you could potentially take action against them. I'd like to turn to something you say towards the end of your article. The bottom line is that, quote, AI regulation can't be built on piecemeal laws or unenforceable guidelines. Hong Kong struggles highlight the real world limitations of trying to bolt rules onto outdated systems. The EU shows the power of principle-based risk-tiered regulation, while Singapore demonstrates the agility of a collaborative, innovation-friendly approach. End quote. I personally wonder if those two approaches can be harmonized, as you go on to say, quote, the answer lies in combining these lessons, a unified principle-driven law, proportionate risk-based oversight, enforceable standards, and international harmonization. Regulation must evolve as quickly as AI itself, not to slow it down, but to ensure that innovation happens safely, transparently, and for the benefit of society. End quote. In the time we've got left, is there anything you feel we didn't cover? Anything you'd like to say? You have the last word.
No, no, I think what I would just want to point out here is one of the most important things that we haven't mentioned is public engagement and education. We really are, we need to build societal trust by educating citizens on AI risks, rights, and safeguards, and ensuring transparency around how AI decisions are being made. I, again, I think that we're failing in respect of education and public engagement. This is not an isolated situation in respect of AI. It's rather an issue across the board. We could even speak to this in respect of evolving financial crime typologies.
But
You know,
how far would you go with is this because does the education have to be received just by professionals, or is this something society-wide? Is it holistic? Do you need to start does AI need to be a component of the average citizen's education moving forward, in which case you need to get them while they're young?
something actually, you don't need to get them while they're young. You need to do Sing again, we keep talking about Singapore today. 2 years ago, Singapore rolled out a $2,000 training scheme for all people and PRs over the age of 40 to go and to basically upskill with new and evolving AI and technology skill sets. Why? Because previous education standards hadn't incorporated them. So Singapore made a conscious effort for every single citizen in their country to adapt and to adopt new skill sets in the AI technology field to support the aging population, but also the need for innovation and AI and technology development within Singapore. that was a great example about public engagement and education, about how we are not just looking at the younger generation, but we're helping to educate the older generation. You could also speak to this about like deep fakes. And I was on a webinar discussing deep fakes and about how, you know, we we have I suppose a challenge globally at the moment where we trust what we see without verifying it. And what we're actually going to find moving forward is that we're going to move from I suppose, what could you say here, a trust by, trust by default, which is what the current system is, to verify by default, where consumers are going to have installed in their phones technology or apps that help them identify deep fakes in social media platforms. Banks are going to be using this as well in respect of facial recognition and biometrics, where that's being changed at the user's in the user's device. And some banks already deployed this. So long story short is we need to change the way in which the public at large trusts what they see and what they hear, and instead moves towards a kind of a verification by default model, which means that we need to, and this will enable us to put a social brake on abuse, so to speak, and help us reduce a lot of the losses that are resulting as a result of voice impersonation, deep fake impersonation, which has increased. I think voice impersonation cases increased by, was it 1,300% year on year last year. It was incredible. And that's just what's been reported.
Fascinating conversation, Una. It's brave new world, actually a terrifying new world. Una, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, AJ. And thank you, Prof, in the background.
We will be right back. And we're back. In this segment, we'll be discussing an article published earlier this summer entitled, How Well Does the Money Laundering Control System Work? With the authors Dr. Mirko Nazzari and Professor Peter Reuter. Their piece, which is about 50 pages long, appeared in a scholarly journal known as Crime and Justice, Volume 54, 2025. The authors take a critical look at the global anti-money laundering system and ask a simple but key question. Has it actually made money laundering tougher or riskier for criminals? The answer, which is more complicated and perhaps less encouraging than many might hope, is that it's a question for which there are multiple answers at the local, national, transnational, and global levels. Dr. Nazzari and Professor Reuter's essay therefore offers a critical and data-driven analysis of the global AML regime, highlighting the lack of empirical evidence that money laundering has become more difficult or less prevalent, the often symbolic nature of international evaluations, such as the Financial Action Task Force mutual evaluations, the high cost and often unintended consequences of AML measures, including de-risking, and the central role of private entities in detecting suspicious activity with significant operational implications. Though it's lengthy, it's a highly recommended read for anyone working or interested in AML, financial crime, and public policy evaluation. Simply put, money laundering remains a significant concern worldwide, with substantial resources dedicated to preventing illicit funds from entering the financial system. Yet, after decades of legislative and regulatory development, the effectiveness of AML frameworks is still rather dubious. Again, the article is a sharp, data-informed critique of the current state of the international AML apparatus. The authors highlight 7 key findings that challenge conventional wisdom. First, that major banks regularly face large fines, but executives rarely face criminal convictions. Then there's the fact that money laundering is no more complex or expensive today than it was in the late 1980s. Most laundering methods remain surprisingly basic. The system disproportionately benefits wealthy jurisdictions. AML measures yield valuable intelligence for law enforcement, but they also carry risks, including, as I said earlier, de-risking and data misuse. And lastly, the real costs of AML compliance are rarely part of the public debate. In the abstract to their piece, the authors state, quote, the continued globalization of finances has generated an ever larger array of methods for making criminal earnings appear legitimate. The global regime to control money laundering has become more sophisticated and comprehensive, as well as expensive and intrusive. There is no evidence that money laundering is declining or becoming more difficult or expensive. The system's failure has many sources. Nations which pushed for its creation and development have been unwilling to implement critical elements. Major banks have repeatedly failed to meet their obligations, suggesting that either insufficient commitment or a lack of the necessary skills and systems to comply. Regulatory oversight has been inadequate. There is, however, evidence that the system aids enforcement of laws against criminal enterprises. Despite the consensus that the system works poorly, there is almost no discussion of substantial reforms. End quote. As to our authors, Mirko Nazzari is a postdoctoral fellow in political science at Università degli Studi di Sassari in Italy. I hope I got that right. Peter Reuter is a distinguished university professor at the School of Public Policy in the Department of Criminology at the University of Maryland in the U.S. Detailed biographies of the authors can be found on our website. And with that, I shall turn over to them. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
So, in terms of your key observations and conclusions, there are three that leapt out at me, and feel free to elaborate on them as you see fit. First, the persistence of simple laundering strategies. Second, the limited adoption of sophisticated methods such as cryptocurrencies. And third, the predominance of self-laundering over professional services. Would you care to flesh those out?
I think Mirko is actually more knowledgeable about these aspects than I. So, Mirko, why don't you go first?
Yes, sure. I think that this is one of the main findings, I would argue, of our work, of our study, because, and it actually also resonates with most of the studies that we can find in empirical literature on the money laundering, let's say, topic and domain. Simply because basically most of these studies, including ours, show that most of offenders basically do not engage in sophisticated money laundering activities at all. This can be quite surprising, if we read a newspaper, if we read journalistic also investigations, we usually find claims about ever-growing money laundering, a larger array, I would say, of money laundering techniques, ever more complicated and sophisticated, in order to overcome the increasing control imposed by, of course, obliged entities and all the controls that we have established since the basically establishment of the Financial Action Task Force in 1989. But again, empirical evidence says otherwise. Not that, of course, these strategies do not exist at all. This is far from what we try to argue in our paper, but that most of these offenders do not need to engage in these strategies at all because it's not simply necessary. In order for them, at least, to overcome, for example, know your customer obligations by some major banks or insurance companies and so on and so forth, they can still rely on simple schemes. Simple schemes still work. This is the main point that in a certain way we are trying to make in our study. And this is something that it tells us something about the functioning and effectiveness of the anti-money laundering system. If we assume that our system is working, if we assume that we are making life harder and more difficult to offenders, we should see them, trying to engage in ever more sophisticated schemes to avoid our basically detection. But again, this is
yeah.
yes, Peter.
Let me just add something about what we mean by simple schemes, I mean, one sort of notorious incident involved one of the four major British banks, and the launderer was a mid-sized jewelry company in somewhere in the Midlands, and the staff was bringing in literally sacks of money, sacks that actually sometimes broke, and the banking staff would then have to sort of find another bag to put it in. And gee, I mean, if you ever think about what looks like dirty money, it's literally money that's falling out of the bag. And yet, for some years, this went on, and the bank filed not a single suspicious activity report. Who needs cryptocurrency when you face that kind of non-scrutiny? And I mean, these are, of course, all stories about extremes, but there are enough of these stories that you have to sort of shake your head at the notion that you need to be sophisticated to get through this system with dirty money.
Yeah, I think you summarized pretty well in this sense. Again, this is something that is often an assumption, a big assumption in the field. Again, that we are trying to catch smart criminals, smart offenders that are really tech savvy in a way. That's something that I also dealt with in some of my other works related to the cybercrime domain, for example. In that case, I looked at our big ransomware group, basically, again, involved in ransomware and managing ransomware payments in Bitcoin, for example. You could assume that these guys are, again, tech savvy, experienced criminals. They are top level offenders, and they would, in a way, engage in sophisticated money laundering techniques and schemes, again, to avoid the detection of obliged entities and so on. But that, again, was not the case. Most of these offenders, at least from my findings and also some other findings in the literature, do not really know anything about money laundering. They are, of course, involved in their market, illegal market. They are well aware of their predicate offenses, as we can call them, and the workings of these offenses. But when it comes to money laundering, they are still very inexperienced, especially when it comes to, for example, cryptocurrencies. If you look again at the newspapers, you always look and see about claims of the growing relevance of cryptocurrencies in money laundering techniques. That for sure happens for some offenders, but again, it's not the common, I would say, common rule, at least for now. We will see what, in a way, the future holds on that regard. But still, one of also the main findings in the literature, again, is that money laundering is a very broad term, I would say, for indicating a wide array of activities and schemes and techniques that are used, again, by a broader array of offenders. Each of these offender has its unique characteristics, for example, its unique driver, constraints, and so on and so forth. And I think that also Peter explored these specific characteristics and dynamics in a recent paper with Dr. Michele Riccardi from Transcrime. And again, we cannot assume that all these offenders, for example, will behave the same. All of them will engage, for example, in complicated and sophisticated money laundering, or on the other side, on simple money laundering techniques. We really need to look at each case without trying to generalize in a way too much.
Right. So I mean, given an instance of that, a lot of our image of money laundering comes from drug traffickers, and drug trafficking is the source of I think, the majority of money laundering cases, at least in the US. Drug traffickers have an unusual problem. They have lots of cash flowing in on a regular basis. And so their task is to convert cash into some form that they can separate from the crime. That is not the problem faced by corrupt government officials. They never see cash, probably. Maybe occasionally they do, but it's deposits into unnamed bank accounts in dodgy jurisdictions. And so it's, we talk about money laundering as though it's sort of fairly uniform phenomenon, but the problem that different types of offenders face are very different. And so they use a whole variety of techniques. And a lot of it is outside the formal financial system. For example, hawalas move money across international boundaries without actually moving the money, just settling up net positions at the end of the quarter or month, however they do it.
It's good to point that out, that a drug dealer isn't the same as a kleptocrat, who isn't the same as a crypto criminal, because it's different typologies, but also different intent. So there is that. I'd also like to come to some of the current challenges you point to, three in particular: that the limited policy debate, the focus on incremental improvements rather than reform, and that the current system sustainability in the long run. Because I mean, it in my view, I mean, the current system to fight financial crime has not worked and won't work moving forward. I mean, despite an exponential increase in obligations for gatekeepers, I mean, regulators keep finding banks, while the same laundering techniques keep appearing. But banks just regarded as another cost of doing business, and no one seems to care about reputational loss. And then when it comes to financial crime figures, as estimated in 1989, they continue to be the same, amounting to about 2 to 5% of global GDP. Now that's created the system focused on compliance rather than addressing real risk, and the current interaction between stakeholders has developed it's delivered a suboptimal system, because the funds spent between both private and public stakeholders is mostly wasted. Now, some have suggested a system reboot, but then the question is how. Now, Mirko, I think you pointed out that before, that SAR, suspicious activity reports, contribute to investigations. But even you pointed out, you query how sustainable they are over time, because out of fear, MLROs want to report everything because they don't want to be fined. But then if you look at FinCEN at the U.S. Treasury, again, it's debatable how much, to what extent they can process 4 million SARs annually. They can't meaningfully tackle that. That's an informational sensory overload. It's like aiming a fire hose in a teacup. I'll remain silent now. Perhaps I've said too much, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts.
So let me take up on this issue of why is there no serious debate about major reforms of the system? And I mean, about 10 years ago, I gave a talk at RUSI, the Royal Uniform Services Institute, which has been a real player in this space in terms of analyses of money laundering policies. And for these purposes, completely obscure academic, and there was, for RUSI, a big audience there of professionals involved in this, in money laundering control. And I gave a very, very primitive version of the paper that we published this year, and very negative views. And what shocked me was just the uniformity with which people came up to me afterwards and said, in effect, they had no faith in the system, which was giving them a generous salary, and that they all thought that it failed.
So Peter, then they're just cynically showing up for a paycheck.
Look, is this a shocking statement? But the point was that
compliance does pay.
Compliance does pay, and pays many people. And so that started me sort of curious why, in face of this sort of uniformly negative view of the professionals in the field, there wasn't any debate. And one answer is the cynical one, who's going to complain when they get a good paycheck. But it's not just the professionals, it's that government. I mean, I think there are many actors that benefit from the system, even if it works badly. And just sort of that's one of the themes of the article. So just let's go through them. U.S. government, which is a critical actor here because it's the threat of cutting off access to dollar transactions, that brings many countries into line with the FATF requirements. From the US point of view, this is a system which allows it to expand its extraterritorial powers very substantially. So whether it works well or not is in a way beside the point. This is an extension of US sort of commercial powers. The banks themselves, the big banks see this as a barrier to entry for newcomers. There are real sort of economies of scale here and economies of experience. And I would argue, it's less conspicuous, but I would argue that they like the fact that they can decide to violate. I mean, every major bank has a major fine against it, some in the billions, certainly all of them in the many hundreds of millions. And these are not so the result of rogue employees. These are typically decisions made by the board to allow this to go on. And money laundering is a profitable activity for a bank. So the banks are not particularly interested in reform. They may claim it's expensive and ineffective, but it's not clear that that costs them anything. The non-profits that have been pressing for various kinds of reform, with particular with beneficial ownership, they like the fact that this is available as a tool to go after authoritarian governments who abuse money laundering controls to go after their enemies. And the authoritarian governments like this because it does allow them to go after their enemies under the guise of some sort of reputable tool, using some reputable tool. So it's very hard to identify any group that really has an interest in reform, except good government groups, and they aren't exactly in ascendance now. So I think one thing that got me really interested in writing this paper was thinking about why isn't there more reform when everybody agrees it isn't working? And I think we make something of a contribution just by ticking those, showing why it really isn't in anyone's interest to make it work much better, or to create something much different from what they have now.
Peter, I'm glad you brought up the US because, I mean, you recall that in March, the Trump administration said it was going to scale back enforcement of AML rules, specifically under the Corporate Transparency Act, particularly with regard to beneficial ownership. The administration claimed that the act was burdensome, it was passed under the Biden administration, and that it posed an onerous compliance obligation for small and medium firms. I mean, at least that was the that was the pretext, but they said that they would halt enforcing any penalties or fines under the beneficial ownership information reporting rule under the existing regulatory deadlines, and that they would not further enforce any penalties or fines against U.S. citizens or domestic reporting companies or their beneficial owners under the forthcoming changes. And so I guess the net result was people said the U.S. will no longer require shell companies to disclose their owners and beneficiaries, allowing wealthy corporations and individuals to hide their profits from the public. So what does that herald? Because it seems like a dark future then in terms of enforcement. If the people who pushed for the most aggressive enforcement to begin with, and the ones with the greatest tools to impose their will and ensure global enforcement, are now saying we're going to scale it back. We don't want to hurt our own companies, but and of course, then there's always the danger of selective enforcement, given the capricious nature of this administration. What are we to expect?
I mean, I think you've answered your own question. There have long been accusations about the Trump Corporation and the sources of money for its activities, and there's the president has been perfectly open that he thinks AML is more a a drain on U.S. corporate activities, and he wants to scale back this in many dimensions. I think probably Mirko actually knows more about the ongoing efforts to unravel the system than I do, but I think there's no doubt that the system will be weakened even from its not very effective version now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think this is also, again, one of the three mechanisms that we identified in the paper regarding why the system could not perform as we expect, could not be as much effective as we want. And again, it was the first one. We named it like defection, about FATF rules by countries, by the countries that are supposed to hold and push the system in a way. In this case, in the paper we discussed about, for example, some countries not implementing all of the FATF 40 recommendations. And again, here there are plenty of examples about, for example, the US. If we think, for example, about the case of lawyers, that they are still debated, but they are not obliged entities in the US compared to many other countries. Just making the case, for example, of Italy, my home country in a way. So this creates in a way differences and between countries that can be in a way, of course, exploited by offenders, but they damage the system itself. Then, of course, cannot just be defections in implementation, but as you were discussing, also potential defections in the long run. So we have the US president saying that, of course, AML imposes a significant cost on US corporates. And we do not want to do that. We need to scale back, again, the controls, the obligations on our companies and so on and so forth. So this still can, of course, impact the system on the long run, and has been also already at least recognized by many other countries and the FATF itself. But I think that, and I also want to take a step back here, talking about a point that you raised earlier in terms of sustainability of the system, because of course we are trying, and again, it's something that we mentioned in the abstract of our study, we are trying to build an ever more, comprehensive system that basically tries to block any gaps that can be exploited by offenders. But in a way, we are also building an intrusive system. And I think we need to reflect, at least in terms of the sustainability of the system in the long run. It's something that I've highlighted, and we have highlighted in the paper in terms of, for example, of the suspicious activity reports, as you mentioned. Just again, let's take the case of the United States. In the first years of FinCEN, the US financial intelligence units, they received less than 100,000 suspicious activity reports. If we take the last years, 2023, 2024, the last data that we had, these numbers skyrocketed basically to more than 4 million. Now, of course, there are plenty of explanation in terms of the rise of the number of suspicious activity reports. We mentioned in the study, of course, the number of obliged entities, the increased number of obliged entities, the increased number of obligated sectors, the better reporting systems, the better capabilities of analysts, and so on and so forth. But basically, there is also a big elephant, I would say, in the room, and is also acknowledged by many FIUs worldwide, is the so-called defensive filing. So, as you pointed correctly earlier, we are imposing, in a way, of course, obligations on some private actors, and we are saying that if you do not do well your job, we are going to fine you for non-compliance and so on and so forth. Of course, on their end, they do not want to get fines and so on, and so they just try to flag everything. This is a problem because, again, passing from 100,000 to 4 million is not just easy in terms of analyzing these reports, just because, of course, the resources allocated to FinCEN have not increased at the same rate over the last 30 years, and we point some figures also in the study. This is something that happens also in Europe, in Europe, for example, in Italy. is something that has already been flagged by the Italian Financial Intelligence Unit, saying that we are receiving, in a way, too many suspicious activity reports that do not bring real evidence that can be actioned from an investigative point of view. So we really need to find here some mechanisms, but we cannot just keep going in a way. Yes.
That's a common refrain, Mirko, around the world. That you have to be able to, HKMA even says, you have to be able to articulate your suspicion. But again, if the tendency to just file everything has resulted in a lot of duplicative filings.
Well, but let me make a defense for a system which hoovers up lots of reports which in themselves have no value, but cumulatively enable the government to make connections that they otherwise would be unable to make between offenders that they are tracking and offenders that they don't know about. So these are huge intelligence bases. And there are a small number of US studies, I think by GAO, which show that a very large share of criminal cases made by the Department of Justice and Treasury make use of the SARS database. And whether that is worth all the costs that the AML system imposes is a fair question. And I actually think the answer is almost certainly no. But you have to recognize that this is, for better or for worse, creating databases that make for much more effective investigation of criminal offenders who handle large sums of money. So I just as sort of due diligence on our part as researchers, one shouldn't sort of sweep that away and just say, oh, there are all these non-actionable suspicious activity reports. You really need to look at the database that's created from this. You can have privacy concerns that are quite serious here, but you have to acknowledge that creating those databases has its own value.
I agree with that, Peter, but I'm struck by two cases that we had in Hong Kong about a decade ago. These were multi-billion-dollar cases. And the culprits in one instance were an elderly woman receiving instructions from a woman in her home village in mainland China that she kind of sort of remembered from her youth, and another young man, again, two separate estate, both individuals living on separate public housing estates. And these were multi-billion-dollar cases. And the judge said, look, you're clearly not the masterminds, but you should have known better. Now, the point was, these were multi-billion-dollar cases. The banks did their part. They filled out their, suspicious transaction reports. They fed them on to the JFIU, the Joint Financial Intelligence we have in Hong Kong, which is comprised of both the police and the Customs and Excise Department. And the net result was the banks did their part, but the JFIU did not connect the dots in time. And that's on them, because again, around the world, no government official is going to admit this, but most FIUs are overworked. They're overwhelmed. It's the informational, it's the sensory overload, the fire hose of the teacup. How much are you going to retain, and how much will you be able to act on in a timely manner?
Well, you don't have to be a true conspiracy theorist to say, well, so here it is. We encourage banks to file too many large numbers of transaction reports, but then starve the agencies of the ability to use them. Well, isn't that sort of an effort to facilitate money laundering dressed up as
when you defang the regulators?
Defund the regulators. Now, I don't think anyone is, at least in democratic countries, is that strategic. But I think to criticize the system because it fails to exploit all the information it collects is to criticize not the system itself, but the politicians who make decisions about funding. I think the problems are much deeper than that. And
And
Okay.
you address some of them in term. You got both you and Mirko address them in terms of the policy choices you guys advocate. I mean, the 3 points that leapt out: the need to set realistic goals, which goes to what we were discussing, the development of alternative effectiveness metrics, and balance between AML controls and financial inclusion. And that's most apropos because just in our last episode, we had Lottie Zabel from the Asian Development Bank stating that rising compliance costs and regulatory fragmentation and de-risking were limiting cross-border banking access, and that was leading to financial disinclusion. She thought technology-driven solutions might offer a path to restore connectivity. But I mean, it's such an entrenched problem. Regulators say banks should adopt a risk-weighted approach to compliance and not engage in wholesale de-risking. Yet correspondent banking and the related AML KYC issues with certain sectors is a perennial one. And the sad truth is de-risking occurs because compliance costs for banks to maintain correspondent banking relationships with certain individuals or firms or categories of customers is just too great given the small profit from serving them or the enhanced risk associating with serving a particular class of client, or the customer's business volumes are too small. What are your thoughts? Because I mean, are we not in a state of compliance overkill, with many bankers grumbling that most of what they do on a daily basis is compliance rather than the real business banking? They say banking is no longer fun.
Gee, I don't put that high on the list of things I worry about. Yeah, look, I'm not an expert about banking regulation in general. So if Mirko has something to say about it, I don't really. But actually, so let me address: is this overregulation? I think if you create a more sort of sensible and targeted AML system, you would reduce the reporting burdens. I mean, everyone for the last 25 years have been saying there are literally no incentives to look at suspicious activity reports seriously before filing them. You are never penalized for filing a frivolous suspicious activity report, except maybe in Switzerland. Switzerland has, as is so often the case, a very different system, and they really do push the banks to provide some evidence for suspicious activity report. But elsewhere, it's just it is a paper requirement, and it does produce a flood. But as I said, it's a flood of information that has some useful consequences that are long run and never get really acknowledged. I mean, if I might make a more general point, which is one of the striking things is just how primitive are the assessments of this system. It certainly costs globally in the hundreds of billions. The treasury departments that are the major players in this, in the US, UK, France, etc., are institutions which do a lot of research. They're often very highly regarded in their fields for the research staffs they have, and yet on money laundering, they've been utterly absent in an effort to provide any kind of assessment of how all the system's working. And after a while, you have to sort of think there's some information in the fact that they don't try to measure their success.
Yeah, just adding on this point, I think that the truth in a way lies in the middle, in the sense that, of course, we need to acknowledge, as also Peter correctly said before, that the system itself in some ways is working, of course. Just again mentioning the suspicious activity reports, we know that there are some issues, and we discuss it in terms of the number that then again financial intelligence units need to work on a daily basis. But of course, some of them have contributed in a meaningful way to law enforcement investigation, to catching offenders, and so on and so forth. So we need to, in a way, of course, acknowledge the pros and what we have successfully achieved with the system. On the other hand, in a way, we are and we need to criticize itself when it does not work properly, but not just in sense that, okay, let's get rid of it altogether. This is in a way is potentially not feasible. We need to be also in a way realistic, and we potentially do not want to do that. But we need really to think what we can do better instead of just, tweaking some of the main regulations and obligations that we impose on obliged entities. And here I think it comes into play again, trying to measure the effectiveness, trying to look at better data that we have done so far. When we talk about trying to measure the effectiveness of the system, and we discuss it plenty in the study, most of the data come from the system itself. We look at, again, at suspicious activity reports. We look at the number of convictions per country. We look at the number of assets confiscated. This is useful, but up to a certain point, we really need to look in a way at the system and at the phenomenon itself. What, again, are offenders doing? Are we making life of offenders harder? Are we making for them harder to launder illicit proceeds? So I think that at least we need to switch, we need to change how we look at the phenomenon. And just to leave potentially on a more positive note, we are doing it, at least in the academic world. There are plenty of new studies trying to use new data, trying to change the main perspective of how we analyze money laundering. I think that in a way, results are really interesting and useful potentially for improving the system itself.
So in your paper, you point out that AML has never been about and should not be about money laundering itself. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, this is so when I first got into this field 20 years ago, I thought that was, I was working with a former central banker, Ted Truman, and I thought our most basic insight was that you shouldn't pay attention to the wording of the label, anti-money laundering. This is simply like conspiracy. I mean, conspiracy is a charge you bring not because conspiracy is bad, but because in order to execute certain kinds of crimes, you need to conspire. Well, the same thing here. It's not that money laundering generates such terrible consequences. It's that having rules about money laundering enables you to go after certain kinds of crimes. I mean, putting it in its most basic form. And so it's not how much money laundering have you prevented, it's how much crime have you prevented. And there's, there's so little work on this topic that I think that basic insight, which I'm very confident, just keeps getting lost, and people focus on what's on the label, money laundering, but that's not what anti-money laundering is about.
My sense is that whereas once upon a time people weren't as interested in money laundering, they were more interested in reducing predicate offenses. Clearly now money laundering has become the focus of the system, which I guess begs the question, what can be done to improve AML methods and procedures without compromising privacy?
As an important question, first of all, I agree, of course, with Peter on what he has just said. In the end, money laundering is just the immediate target of the system, but what we really want to do is to reduce predicate offenses and reduce the harm connected to these offenses. How we can do it better, for sure, this is a question we need to keep asking in the future, and how we can improve the system. I think it's, potentially we do not have the answer to that right now, and it's something that also we close in the study, because it's not an easy question. Redefining the system as a whole is for sure complex. We cannot expect, for example, the FATF and all the other stakeholders involved to just change everything overnight. But for sure, and I agree with you, we really need to keep into focus the privacy, for sure, of customers and so on, because this is an aspect that is often neglected in the debate, both in the academia and potentially in the policy-making circles. And it's something that, again, has been recently highlighted. For example, I'm thinking about another study by Raymer in Rusi that again they analyze exactly how, for example, FATF rules can be potentially misused for illegitimate purposes by some type of regimes. And I think that this is key as an important topic to keep discussing in the future. But again, it's not so easy to point out some key recommendation. We tried something in the paper, and you mentioned it earlier, trying to scaling back some, or at least setting some more realistic objectives. That's for sure. On the end, we also may need to reason again on the sustainability. So can we keep including more and more obliged entities? We have done just for the last sector, so cryptocurrency. Now there are, of course, as you well know, obliged entities, cryptocurrency and VASP, so virtual asset service providers. They are obliged entities. They need to comply, as all the other obliged entities have done in the last decades. For them, of course, it's a challenge. We need to be sure that the cryptocurrency environment is not abused. But again, it's I would say a whole new branch of economy that's come under scrutiny. And that's, of course, bears much costs to these new actors. And it's something that we also need to, again, keep into mind when we keep enlarging the reach of the system itself.
I thought it was striking that 97% of the countries, according to the FATF, I mean, of the 120 in total, the FATF concluded 97% had low to moderate effective risk management and risks associated with money laundering. I mean, having watched this space for over 20 years, written about it, not being a practitioner though, but it seems to me that how well you do in terms of compliance processes and protocols, quality of your compliance, how good of a mutual evaluation you get, has nothing to do with the amount of dirty money sloshing around your economy. I'm sorry, I interrupted, Peter. You were about to say something.
Yeah, no. I mean, so the UK is the case in point. The UK got, by the FATF standards, a glowing mutual evaluation report, but everyone would agree that the UK is the destination of a very large share of dirty money, and the Cameron administration 10 years ago said it was going to crack down, and I think every administration since then has also said it will crack down, but it doesn't actually seem to have much effect. So
on the overseas dependent territories, which are notorious for tax evasion, and in fact, when the Panama Papers broke, I was like, it's all well and good for Cameron. He was Prime Minister to berate the Europeans, but some of the biggest culprits were the overseas dependent territories under the British Crown. And when the only solution, it seemed to me, was some kind of beneficial ownership under the auspices of the UN. But again, that's not going to happen, because this is where the political and economic interests of nation states enter into it, because they want those funds to flow into their
shores. Yeah. I mean, money laundering is an attractive activity for countries if the money is generated by crime elsewhere, and that is the charge against the Swiss. I mean, the Swiss have had to make changes, and I think they're substantially less welcoming of dirty money than they used to be.
But they in Dubai, they just plow on.
Right. No, Dubai is, I think, the contemporary bad guy for all of this.
In the time we've got left, do you have any closing remarks? Anything you guys want to say about the Anti-Money Laundering Act of the EU? I mean, any closing remarks that you feel we ought to leave our audience with? Anything you feel we didn't cover?
I mean, we didn't make recommendations. We're not we should not be making recommendations. We're experts in an academic sense about money laundering controls, but we're not banking experts. the system we have now clearly doesn't work. It's widely recognized, almost universally recognized as not working. It is important enough that you'd hope that some international body like the IMF and World Bank would create some commission that really explores what are plausible alternatives taking into account for that economic and political realities. And it's very depressing that this global, universally recognized failure has not generated a meaningful reform effort. We're not the ones to say how it should be done. I guess we're just here to say it needs to be done.
Fair enough. Mirko?
Yeah, no, I think that's for sure. I agree with Peter, and I think that we really, in a way, need to keep the momentum up and keep continuing discussing the system, keep discussing the effectiveness of the system, and trying to come up with new ways of measuring this effectiveness. We know that the system potentially is not working as we expect and as it should be, but for now, I mean, also most of the efforts have been done in the field in trying also to measure the effectiveness, for example, has been flawed by the lack of data. We always stress the importance of having high quality data. For sure, this is a main point for the future in terms of, for example, also collaboration and partnership between the academia and the stakeholders not only in the private sector, but again, as Peter mentioned, the FATF itself, IMF, and so on and so forth. We need data for the analysis, and then in the end, we can potentially provide some more grounded empirical evidence on which we can then develop recommendations. But for now, we are still, and this is potentially something interesting to our listeners and readers, we are still really in a rudimental stage where we still try to analyze the phenomenon itself because we lack data, good, reliable data.
I guess watch this space. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting us.
And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.